This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The Carter family lived on the outskirts of a small, rural town in Oklahoma, where the flat, endless plains stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by clusters of trees and the occasional telephone pole. Their home, a weathered farmhouse that had seen better days, sat at the end of a dirt road far removed from the center of town. Once white with bright blue shutters, the paint on the house had faded and peeled over the years, exposing the gray, splintering wood beneath. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the yard, once lovingly maintained, had grown wild with weeds and thistles. An old tire swing hung limply from a lone oak tree in the front yard, swaying in the occasional gust of wind, as though haunted by the laughter of children who no longer played there. The house stood in lonely defiance of the emptiness around it, a symbol of resilience, but also of neglect. Evelyn Carter, the 30-year-old single mother who lived there, had grown up not far from this very spot. Her family had farmed the land for generations, but the farm itself had been sold off years ago, piece by piece, until only the house and a few surrounding acres remained. The house had been passed down to her after her parents died, first her father, then her mother just a few years later. Evelyn had held on to it, partly out of a sense of duty and partly because she had nowhere else to go. It was the only constant in her life, the only place that had ever felt like home, even as it fell into disrepair around her. Evelyn was a woman who wore her hardships visibly, her face lined with worry that belied her age. Her dark brown hair, once thick and glossy, now hung limp around her face, streaked with premature gray from years of stress and exhaustion. Her pale blue eyes, once full of quiet determination, now seemed dull and distant, as though she were always looking at something far away. She had been a mother since she was 21, and her life since then had been defined by sacrifice. Every decision she made, every dollar she earned, went toward keeping a roof over her daughters' heads and food on the table. She worked part-time jobs whenever she could find them, cleaning houses, stocking shelves at the local grocery store, but it was never enough. The bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and the weight of her financial struggles pressed on her like an invisible hand, squeezing the life out of her dreams. A collaboration between the hotel and library. Her 3 daughters, Abigail, Grace, and Lily, were the light of her life, though even that light was beginning to dim under the shadow of her circumstances. Abigail, the eldest at 9 years old, was the most serious of the 3. With her straight brown hair and solemn brown eyes, she had taken on a maturity beyond her years, often stepping in to help her mother with chores or look after her younger sisters. Abigail rarely smiled anymore, her childhood innocence slipping away under the burden of responsibility. She was old enough to understand the tension in the house, the way her mother's voice grew sharper with every unpaid bill, the way the cupboard seemed to hold less food each week. Grace, the middle child at 7, was the opposite of Abigail, playful and full of energy, with a head of wild, curly blonde hair and a gap-toothed grin that seemed to light up the room. Grace was the one who still believed things would get better, the one who found joy in small moments, like chasing fireflies in the backyard, or drawing pictures with crayons on scraps of paper. Her laughter, though less frequent these days, was a reminder of the life Evelyn had once envisioned for her children, a life filled with happiness and possibility. But even Grace had begun to sense that something was wrong. She had started asking questions Evelyn couldn't answer, questions about why they didn't have enough money, or why her mother always seemed so sad. Lily, the youngest at 4, was the baby of the family, the one Evelyn worried about the most. With her cherubic face, big blue eyes, and soft golden curls, Lily still had the innocence her sisters had begun to lose. She didn't understand the tension that filled the house, the way her mother sometimes snapped at her for no reason, or why Abigail and Grace whispered to each other in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't listening. And she didn't know the secrets, or else she might decide what really happened and shut her mother out. Lily clung to her mother with the desperation of a child who didn't yet realize how fragile the world around her was. She spent her days playing with a ragged stuffed rabbit she called Mr. Floppy, a toy she refused to let out of her sight. To Lily, her mother was a source of comfort and security. Even as Evelyn felt herself slipping further and further away, from being the mother she wanted to be. The Carters lived a life of quiet isolation. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the girls were homeschooled, partly because Evelyn couldn't afford to send them to public school, and partly because she was afraid to let them out of her sight. She had become increasingly paranoid over the years, convinced that the world was full of dangers waiting to hurt her children. Strangers, illness, accidents. Everything outside the walls of their home seemed like a threat. She rarely let the girls leave the property, except for occasional trips into town for groceries or supplies. Evelyn believed she was protecting them, but in reality, the isolation only deepened the cracks in their fragile family. The farmhouse itself was a reflection of their lives, once sturdy and full of promise, now fraying at the edges. The roof leaked when it rained and the floors creaked underfoot. The kitchen table was scarred with scratches and stains, a testament to years of meals eaten in silence. The girls' shared bedroom was cramped, their beds lined up against the walls, with just enough space in between for a worn-out rug. Their toys were few and well-loved, the kind of hand-me-downs that spoke of a life lived on the edge of poverty. To the outside world, the Carters were simply another struggling family trying to make ends meet in a harsh, uncaring world. But behind the closed doors of that weathered farmhouse, Evelyn's desperation was growing. Each passing day felt heavier than the last, her thoughts darker and more tangled. She told herself she was doing her best, but deep down, she knew her best wasn't enough. She didn't know whether to be happy for her sister's health or that she felt pride in debt. And as the weight of her struggles threatened to crush her completely, Evelyn began to spiral into a place from which there would be no return. The breaking point for Evelyn Carter didn't come in a single moment. It wasn't a sudden explosion of emotion or a dramatic event, but a slow and steady unraveling, like a thread being pulled from a fragile tapestry. Each day chipped away at her already fragile mental state, each small failure or frustration piling onto the growing mountain of despair inside her. By the time she began to slip into the darkest corners of her mind, the descent had been so gradual that even Evelyn didn't fully realize what was happening to her. It began with her job, or rather, the loss of it. For months, Evelyn had been cleaning houses in town, scraping together just enough money to keep food on the table and the electricity on. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave her a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed each morning. When the call came that her services were no longer needed, it hit her like a physical blow. She had been replaced by someone younger, faster, and cheaper, and the humiliation of being discarded festered in her mind. Evelyn tried to tell herself she'd find something else, but in a small town with few opportunities, she knew deep down that the options were limited. With no income, the bills began to pile up faster than she could ignore them. The past due notices arrived almost daily, their bright red lettering a constant reminder of her failures. The nights were the worst. Evelyn had always been a light sleeper, but as the stress mounted, her ability to sleep disappeared entirely. She spent her nights staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing, her body too exhausted to move, but too restless to find peace. The house, quiet and still in the dark, seemed to press in on her like a living thing. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside, felt amplified in the silence. She would tiptoe through the house, checking and rechecking that the doors were locked, that the windows were shut tight. She told herself she was just being cautious, but the truth was that her mind was beginning to fracture, her paranoia growing by the day. It wasn't just the financial strain that weighed on her. It was the crushing sense of isolation. Evelyn had no one to turn to, no friends or family to lean on for support. Her parents were long dead, and the few acquaintances she had in town were polite but distant, unwilling or unable to see the depth of her struggles. She felt invisible, as though the world had forgotten she existed. The girls were the only thing tethering her to reality, but even they were becoming harder to face. Every time she looked at their small, innocent faces, she felt the full weight of her inadequacy as a mother. They deserved better than this crumbling house, these empty cupboards, this life of constant struggle. Evelyn's love for her daughters had always been fierce, but now it twisted into something darker, She became consumed with the idea of protecting them, not just from the world, but from herself. She began to believe that she was failing them in ways that couldn't be repaired, that her own inadequacies were the greatest threat to their happiness. The smallest incidents began to spiral into irrational fears. She would keep going over the same thoughts until running out of pain. Her extra painkillers had also begun to secure the door so that she would be careful only from her lower level. When Grace scraped her knee playing outside, Evelyn imagined infections and hospital visits they couldn't afford. When Abigail coughed in her sleep, Evelyn stayed up all night, convinced it was the start of something serious. Every day brought new fears, new ways for the world to hurt her children, and Evelyn felt powerless to stop any of it. As her anxiety grew, so did her paranoia. She stopped letting the girls play outside, afraid they might wander too far or encounter strangers. Trips into town became less frequent, and when they did go, Evelyn kept the girls close to her side, her eyes darting nervously at anyone who looked their way. She began to see danger everywhere, in the cars that sped down the road in front of their house, in the distant barking of neighborhood dogs, in the cracks forming in the walls of their home. The world outside became a hostile, threatening place, and Evelyn's grip on reality began to slip. The turning point came one evening when Evelyn opened the mailbox and found a notice from the bank. Their house, the one constant in their lives, the only thing Evelyn had left to hold on to, was in foreclosure. She had missed too many payments, and now the bank was preparing to take it from her. The thought of losing the house, of having to move her daughters into some unfamiliar, unstable situation, was more than she could bear. That night, as the girls slept in their shared bedroom, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the notice in her hands, staring at it for hours. Her thoughts spiraled into dark, irrational places. She imagined them homeless, wandering the streets, hungry and cold. She imagined the girls being taken away from her, handed over to strangers who couldn't possibly love them the way she did. Evelyn claimed Sarah was her daughter. She never spoke of it, and said the scenarios in her mind grew more vivid, more unbearable, until they felt less like fears and more like inevitabilities. From that moment on, something in Evelyn shifted. Her thoughts, once chaotic and scattered, began to focus on one single horrifying idea, that the only way to truly protect her daughters was to take them away from the world entirely. She convinced herself that the pain and suffering of this life were too much, that sparing them from a lifetime of hardship was the ultimate act of love. It wasn't a decision she made lightly, but as her mind continued to fracture under the weight of her fears, it began to feel like the only choice she had left. Evelyn's love for her daughters, once her greatest strength, had become a weapon turned inward. Cutting through the last threads of her sanity, Evelyn didn't tell anyone what she was thinking. Not that there was anyone to tell. She simply retreated further into herself, her behavior growing more erratic. She became hyper-focused on her daughter's routines, watching them closely as though committing their every movement to memory. She began talking to herself when she thought no one was listening, her voice low and trembling. The girls, sensing the change in their mother, grew quieter, their laughter fading into uneasy silence. They didn't understand what was happening, but they felt the weight of it, the way the house seemed heavier, darker. And so the fragile line between Evelyn's reality and her fears began to blur. What had once been thoughts of desperation became something more sinister, a plan taking shape in the shadows of her mind. Evelyn believed she was doing the right thing, that this was the only way to keep her daughters safe. But in truth, she was already lost, trapped in a spiral of fear and delusion from which there was no escape. The decision didn't come to Evelyn Carter in one sudden blinding moment of madness. Instead, it crept into her mind slowly, piece by piece, like a shadow inching across a dimly lit room. At first, it was just a passing thought, one she tried to shove aside as quickly as it appeared. But the thought lingered, growing roots in the darkest corners of her mind, feeding off her exhaustion, her desperation, and her growing belief that she was losing control of her life. Evelyn didn't want to consider it, didn't want to entertain the possibility, but as the days stretched into nights of restless pacing and sleepless tears, She began to see it as the only solution left. It wasn't about anger or hatred. It wasn't even about herself. In her mind, it was an act of love, a way to save her daughters from the world she believed was closing in on them. Evelyn's plan began to take shape during one of her sleepless nights, as she sat at the kitchen table with her hands trembling around a lukewarm cup of coffee. The house was silent except for the rhythmic creaking of the wind against the walls, a sound she had grown so used to that it felt like part of her own breathing. She stared at the peeling wallpaper, at the pile of unpaid bills on the counter, at the faded family photo taped to the refrigerator. In the photo, Abigail was holding baby Lily in her arms while Grace beamed next to them, her blonde curls catching the sunlight. Evelyn's own face in the picture was smiling, but now, as she looked at it, she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt even a fraction of that happiness. The weight of their lives pressed down on her chest like a stone. The bills would never stop piling up. The isolation would never end. And soon, someone, social services, the bank, the faceless world beyond her control, would take her girls away from her. She was convinced of it. The idea had started as a fear. What if her daughters ended up in foster care? What if they were split apart, sent to homes where they would be mistreated or forgotten? Evelyn had read enough horror stories to believe it could happen. But over time, the fear twisted itself into something darker. If the world was so cruel, so dangerous, then wouldn't it be better if her daughters never had to face it at all? Evelyn had read enough horror stories. Then wouldn't it be better if her daughters never had to face it at all? The thought horrified her at first, and she pushed it away with a wave of nausea. But it returned, over and over, whispering in the quiet hours of the night, until it began to feel like an inevitability. In her mind, it wasn't an act of destruction. It was an act of mercy. Evelyn told herself she would do it quickly, quietly, and with as much love as possible. She didn't want her daughters to suffer. The thought of them being afraid, of looking at her with confusion or betrayal, was unbearable. She resolved to make the final day of their lives beautiful, something that would feel like a celebration, not an ending. She would cook their favorite meals, play their favorite games, and tuck them into bed with kisses on their foreheads. They would fall asleep feeling safe, warm, and loved, and then, when the house was silent and still, she would free them from the pain and uncertainty of the world forever. The practicality of the plan began to take shape in her mind. Evelyn knew she couldn't use violence. It was unthinkable to her, the idea of hurting her daughters in a way that would leave marks or cause them pain. She decided on pills, simple, painless, and quiet. As a nurse, she had enough medical knowledge to know how to use them effectively. She still had access to some leftover medications from her job, hidden in a cabinet she kept locked away from the girls. She spent hours going through the bottles, reading the labels, calculating dosages in her head. The pills would be dissolved in warm milk, a nightly ritual her daughters loved. Lily and Grace always asked for a glass before bed, and Abigail, though she pretended she was too old for it, never said no when Evelyn placed it in her hands. Evelyn rehearsed the plan in her mind countless times, imagining every detail, preparing herself for how she would act. She would not cry, she decided, because she didn't want her daughters to sense anything was wrong. She would smile, laugh, and make sure they felt nothing but love. She even practiced her movements, the way she would pour the milk, the way she would hold the glasses, the way she would kiss their foreheads as they drifted off to sleep. Her resolve was terrifyingly steady. The plan wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, calculated, and cold, in a way that even she didn't fully recognize. As the day drew closer, Evelyn began to detach herself emotionally from the world around her. She stopped answering the phone, stopped looking at the stack of bills on the counter, stopped going into town. None of it mattered anymore. She focused entirely on her daughters, trying to memorize their faces, their voices, their little habits. She watched Abigail braid her hair in the mirror, listened to Grace hum as she played with her dolls, and laughed at Lily's nonsensical stories about Mr. Floppy's imaginary adventures. Every moment felt bittersweet, as though she were mourning them, even while they were still alive. The final piece of the plan was Evelyn herself. She knew she wouldn't be able to live with the guilt of what she was about to do. Once her daughters were gone, she planned to take the remaining pills herself, ensuring that she would never have to face the consequences of her actions. In her mind, it was a way to reunite with them, to keep the family together forever. The idea brought her a strange sense of peace, as though she had already stepped into another world, where the weight of her life no longer mattered. As the night approached, Evelyn felt a calmness settle over her that she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't relief or happiness, but rather the stillness of someone who has accepted their fate. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, tidying the girls' room, folding their clothes, and setting their favorite toys on their beds. She prepared their favorite dinner, a simple but comforting meal of macaroni and cheese, with chocolate pudding for dessert. The day passed like a dream, each moment heavy with finality. Evelyn's mind was made up, and there was no turning back. The night Evelyn Carter carried out her plan was heavy with an unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that seems to anticipate something terrible. The farmhouse, usually alive with the sounds of her daughters laughing, bickering, or playing, felt eerily quiet. Outside, the wind had stilled, leaving the fields and trees around the property frozen in the moonlight. Inside, Evelyn moved with a calm precision, her actions deliberate and practiced. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing it in her mind until it no longer felt real, until it felt like just another step in a story she had already written. But now that the moment had arrived, reality pressed down on her with suffocating weight. She had prepared everything earlier that evening, with the care of a mother planning a celebration. The girls had eaten their favorite dinner, macaroni and cheese with chocolate pudding for dessert. Evelyn had watched them from across the table, her heart aching at the sight of their joy. Lily, the youngest, had giggled as she tried to eat pudding with her fingers, smearing it across her cheeks like war paint. Grace had made up a silly story about the macaroni being magical, while Abigail had rolled her eyes but couldn't quite hide her smile. Evelyn had laughed along with them, her voice steady and light, even as a deep, hollow ache grew in her chest. She had told herself this was for them, that she was saving them from a world that would only break their hearts. But the weight of her own justification felt like a lie she was barely holding together. When dinner was finished, Evelyn helped the girls into their pajamas and let them pick a movie to watch together. They curled up on the worn couch in the living room, surrounded by blankets and stuffed animals, while a cartoon played on the old television. Lily sat in her mother's lap, her small hands clutching her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Floppy. Grace leaned against Evelyn's shoulder, her curls tickling her neck, while Abigail stretched out on the other end of the couch, pretending not to care but occasionally sneaking a glance at the screen. Evelyn held them close, memorizing the feeling of their warmth, the weight of their bodies against hers. She told herself this was how they should remember her: calm, loving, and safe, not the mother who snapped at them when money was tight, or the woman who cried quietly in the bathroom when she thought no one was watching. This would be their last memory, and she wanted it to be perfect. When the movie ended, Evelyn sent the girls upstairs to brush their teeth, her voice gentle but firm as she ushered them into their bedtime routine. She followed them up a few minutes later, carrying 3 glasses of warm milk. In the kitchen, she had dissolved the pills into the milk carefully, ensuring the dosage was just right for each of them. She had tested it earlier in the week, experimenting with honey and cinnamon to mask any bitterness. By now, she was confident they wouldn't notice. It would be quick, painless. They would simply fall asleep and never wake up. Evelyn had convinced herself that this was a kindness, an act of love, but her hands still trembled slightly as she carried the glasses up the stairs. Lily's room was the first stop. The youngest, she was already tucked into bed, her stuffed rabbit cradled in her arms. Evelyn handed her the glass of milk and sat beside her as she drank it, stroking her hair and humming a lullaby she used to sing when Lily was a baby. When the glass was empty, Evelyn kissed her forehead and whispered good night. She stayed by Lily's side, watching as her eyelids grew heavy, her breathing slowing into the soft rhythm of sleep. Evelyn waited until she was sure, her fingers brushing against Lily's tiny hand, cold dread pooling in her stomach. She stayed longer than she planned, the silence in the room unbearable as she forced herself to leave and closed the door behind her. Grace was next. The 7-year-old was still flipping through the pages of a picture book when Evelyn entered the room. Evelyn handed her the milk, sitting beside her and asking about the story she was reading. Grace spoke animatedly, her gap-toothed smile lighting up her face even as she sipped from the glass. Evelyn listened, nodding and smiling, her heart breaking with each word. When Grace finished the milk, Evelyn helped her under the covers, tucking the blanket up to her chin. She kissed her goodnight and whispered how much she loved her, her voice steady despite the tears she was holding back. Grace's eyes fluttered closed, and Evelyn sat there until her breathing slowed, her small body growing still. Abigail, the eldest, was the last. At 9 years old, she was old enough to sense that something wasn't quite right. She hesitated when Evelyn handed her the glass, her sharp brown eyes studying her mother's face. Evelyn forced a smile, urging her to drink, her voice soothing and maternal. Abigail eventually gave in, sipping slowly while Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, stroking her hair. When the glass was empty, Evelyn tucked her in, but Abigail's eyes remained open, watching her mother with a mix of curiosity and unease. Evelyn stayed until her daughter's breathing evened out, her body finally succumbing to the sedative. She kissed Abigail's forehead, murmuring the same words of love and reassurance she had told the others, even as guilt clawed at her insides. When it was done, Evelyn retreated to the hallway, closing each door softly behind her. The silence of the house was deafening. She stood there for what felt like hours, her hand on the banister, her legs unwilling to move. A part of her wanted to run back into the rooms, to shake her daughters awake, to undo what she had done. But she didn't. Instead, she walked downstairs, her movements slow and mechanical. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty glasses she had carried back down with her. The tears came slowly at first, then all at once, shaking her entire body as she pressed her hands to her face. The house was utterly still now, the echoes of her daughter's laughter gone, replaced by a suffocating emptiness. Evelyn told herself this was what love looked like, that she had done the right thing. But deep down, in the quietest part of her mind, she knew the truth. She had destroyed the very thing she had sworn to protect, and no amount of justification could ever bring them back. The morning after Evelyn Carter carried out her plan was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that hung heavy in the air, like the world itself was holding its breath. The sun rose slowly over the Oklahoma plains, its warm light spilling through the farmhouse windows and painting the rooms in soft gold. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, staring blankly at the chipped ceramic mug of coffee she had poured, but not touched. The house, once so alive with the chatter and movement of her daughters, felt like an empty shell. The quiet wasn't the peaceful calm she had imagined it would be. Instead, it was oppressive, a suffocating void that magnified the weight of what she had done. She had spent the night sitting in the same spot, unmoving, too paralyzed by guilt to carry out the final part of her plan. Her resolve had crumbled the moment she descended the stairs after leaving Abigail's room. All the rationalizations she had built up, the belief that she was protecting her daughters, saving them from a cruel and broken world, had shattered under the unbearable weight of their absence. On the 4th floor of the building, a crucial bar that ran from the roof to the bottom of the stairs stood up around the bar. She had told herself she would join them, that they would be together in some better place, but when the time came, she couldn't swallow the pills. She had tried, picking up the bottle with trembling hands, but each time her throat closed and her fingers went slack. Instead, she had spent the night in limbo, staring at the clock as the hours dragged on. The reality of her actions sinking deeper and deeper into her mind. Left to her own devices, by mid-morning, Evelyn had cleaned the kitchen, wiped down the counters, and folded the blankets on the couch. She moved through the motions mechanically, as though tidying up would somehow restore the balance of her broken world. Each task felt futile, a hollow attempt to distract herself from the growing ache in her chest. She could hear the sound of her daughter's laughter in her mind. Echoes, of the life she had stolen from them. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces. The way Lily had clutched Mr. Floppy, the way Grace had smiled up at her, the way Abigail had hesitated, her sharp eyes searching Evelyn's face for answers. The memories clawed at her, threatening to drag her under. The first knock on the door was soft, tentative, almost drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator. Evelyn didn't move at first, unsure if the sound was real or imagined. When the knock came again, louder this time, she jolted upright, her pulse quickening. She had been so consumed by her own grief and guilt that she hadn't considered the outside world, hadn't thought about how long it would take for someone to notice the unnatural stillness surrounding the Carter farmhouse. She walked to the door with heavy, reluctant steps, already knowing who it would be. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived half a mile down the road. She had been a constant presence in their lives, dropping off groceries when Evelyn couldn't afford them, bringing over casseroles when she thought the girls looked too thin. Evelyn had always felt a mix of gratitude and resentment toward her, seeing her kindness as both a lifeline and a reminder of her own inadequacies. Today, Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch with a basket of muffins in her hands, her kind face creased with concern. Evelyn forced a smile and opened the door just wide enough to speak, but Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes caught the hollow look in Evelyn's expression, the unnatural stillness behind her. She asked if everything was all right, her voice laced with genuine worry. Evelyn mumbled something vague, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the door. Mrs. Henderson's concern deepened. She asked about the girls, where they were, why the house seemed so quiet. Evelyn's throat tightened, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to deflect, to say they were sleeping or playing upstairs, but her voice faltered and the lie hung awkwardly in the air. Mrs. Henderson didn't leave. She set the basket down on the porch and stepped closer, peering past Evelyn into the dimly lit house. Evelyn's composure began to crack under the weight of her neighbor's scrutiny. She stepped back, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and Mrs. Henderson pushed past her into the house, calling out for the girls. Evelyn froze, her mind racing, but unable to form a coherent thought. She wanted to stop Mrs. Henderson, but her body wouldn't obey her. Instead, she watched in silence as the woman climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The scream that followed shattered the silence of the house. It was raw, guttural, a sound of pure horror. Evelyn flinched as though she had been struck, her knees buckling as she sank to the floor. She heard Mrs. Henderson's frantic footsteps, the sound of her voice shouting into a phone, calling for help. Evelyn remained where she was, her hands pressed against her temples, her body rocking back and forth as though trying to soothe herself. She didn't fight when the police arrived. She didn't speak when they asked her questions. She simply stared at the floor, her expression vacant, her hands still trembling. The scene in the house was almost too much for the first responders to bear. The girls were found in their beds, their small bodies tucked under the covers as though they were merely sleeping. The stuffed animals on their pillows, the faint scent of warm milk lingering in the air. It was all too deliberate, too calculated. It painted a picture of a mother who had meticulously planned the deaths of her children, who had convinced herself that this was an act of love. Evelyn was taken into custody without resistance. In the days that followed, the news of what had happened spread through the small town like wildfire, leaving the community in a state of shock and disbelief. Neighbors who had once praised Evelyn's dedication as a single mother now whispered about the darkness they hadn't seen, the signs they had missed. The farmhouse became a place of tragedy, its windows dark and its yard overgrown, a haunting reminder of what had happened within its walls. Evelyn, sitting alone in her jail cell, finally allowed herself to cry. The weight of her guilt was unbearable, crushing her under the realization that she hadn't saved her daughters. She had stolen their lives. Her hands, once used to cradle and comfort them, had been the instruments of their deaths. And now, as the silence of the cell closed in around her, she knew there was no escape from the horrors she had created. The aftermath of Evelyn Carter's actions rippled through the small Oklahoma town like a slow-moving storm, leaving devastation in its wake. The house, once filled with the voices of her three daughters, was now a hollow shell, Silence had claimed it entirely, broken only by the creak of the old floorboards and the distant hum of the wind moving through the nearby fields. For Evelyn, the crushing reality of what she had done settled over her like a suffocating weight. She had believed in the distorted depths of her mind that she had been saving her daughters, sparing them from a world of pain and suffering. But in the cold light of day, the emptiness of the house mocked her. There was no peace, no relief, only the inescapable truth that she had stolen their futures and destroyed the very things she had claimed to love most. Leaving aside Midair's childhood, her mission to escape the life that she had grown accustomed to. In the hours following the murders, Evelyn remained in the house, moving through it in a daze. She set the table for breakfast as if the girls might wake up any moment and join her. She folded their clothes, tidied their toys, and even opened the curtains to let in the sunlight. These small mechanical tasks felt like the only thing tethering her to reality. But every action was haunted by the absence of the three little girls who had once brought the house to life. Lily's stuffed rabbit lay abandoned on the couch. Grace's crayons were scattered across the coffee table, and Abigail's favorite chapter book sat unfinished on her nightstand. The weight of their absence pressed down on Evelyn until it felt like she couldn't breathe. She wandered through the house, touching their belongings as if to convince herself they had really existed. But Evelyn's carefully constructed delusion began to crumble when she realized she couldn't face what she had done. She had told herself she would take the remaining pills, that she would join her daughters in death and spare herself the guilt and judgment of the outside world. But as she stood in the kitchen, staring at the bottle in her trembling hands, she found she couldn't do it. Fear gripped her. Fear of what might come next. Fear of the unknown. Fear of her own cowardice. She had planned every detail of her daughters' deaths with meticulous precision, but when it came to herself, she faltered. Instead of taking the pills, she sank to the floor, clutching the bottle to her chest as sobs racked her body. It wasn't long before the silence of the house drew attention. The Carters were a quiet family, but Evelyn's daughters were occasionally seen playing in the yard or accompanying their mother into town. When a full day passed without so much as a glimpse of them, one of their neighbors, an older woman who lived half a mile down the road, grew concerned. She had always thought Evelyn seemed a little fragile, but she admired her determination to raise her daughters on her own. Something about the stillness around the house unsettled her, and by the next afternoon her worry grew unbearable. She walked to the Carters' property, calling out as she approached the porch, but no one answered. The curtains were drawn, and the house seemed lifeless. After knocking on the door several times, the neighbor pushed it open, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and curiosity. What she found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes hollow and unfocused. She didn't react when the neighbor entered, barely seeming to notice her presence. It wasn't until the neighbor ventured further into the house, calling out the names of the girls, that Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as she told the neighbor not to go upstairs. But the warning came too late. The neighbor found the bodies of Abigail, Grace, and Lily in their beds, their small forms perfectly still, as though they were only sleeping. The scene was heartbreakingly peaceful, but the truth was unmistakable. The neighbor stumbled out of the house, shaking and crying, before calling the police. When law enforcement arrived, Evelyn offered no resistance. She answered their questions calmly, admitting to everything with a strange sense of detachment. She explained her reasoning in chilling detail, recounting how she had believed she was protecting her daughters from a cruel and unforgiving world. She spoke of love, of mercy, of saving them from pain, but her words were met with silence and disbelief. To the officers, there was no logic, no justification that could make sense of what she had done. They handcuffed her and led her out of the house, past the neighbor who stood trembling on the porch, and into the back of a police car. Evelyn didn't look back. The town was left reeling in the wake of the tragedy. News of the murders spread quickly, and the community was consumed by shock and grief. Vigils were held for the three girls, their smiling faces printed on flyers that were passed around the town square. Strangers who had never met the Carters wept at the thought of what the children had endured, while those who had known them struggled to reconcile the happy, playful girls they remembered with the horrific end they had met. The farmhouse was cordoned off with police tape, its peeling paint and sagging porch now a symbol of unimaginable loss. No one wanted to go near it, and it was eventually abandoned, left to decay in silence. Evelyn's trial became a national sensation, with psychologists and legal experts debating whether she should be held fully accountable for her actions. The defense argued that she had been suffering from severe mental illness, pointing to her paranoia, financial struggles, and isolation as evidence that she was not in her right mind. The prosecution, however, painted a picture of premeditation and cold calculation, emphasizing the deliberate nature of her plan. Evelyn herself showed little emotion during the trial. She answered questions with quiet resignation, her voice steady but hollow. When asked if she regretted what she had done, she paused for a long moment before saying she didn't know. In the end, Evelyn was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, her mental state deemed insufficient to absolve her of responsibility. She was sent to a maximum security prison where she lived in near total isolation. In her small cell, Evelyn spent her days staring at the walls, her mind replaying the events of that fateful night, over and over again. She tried to convince herself she had done the right thing, that her daughters were at peace, but the echoes of their laughter haunted her in the silence. The weight of her guilt was inescapable, and as the years stretched on, she found herself wishing she had taken the pills that night. For the town, the Carters became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of the dangers of unchecked isolation and untreated mental illness. For Evelyn, the farmhouse she had tried to make a haven for her daughters became the place where everything fell apart, and her name became synonymous with horror. In her mind, she had acted out of love, but in the eyes of the world, she had destroyed it. Making visitations to the place on Friday, Katie learned about losing Charlie, for her son Joe in the suburban town of Elmore.